He opened the door and looked directly at me. Not through me. Not past me. At me. And still he didn't recognize me. For a second I thought my heart would stop. Not because I still loved him. That part of me had already burned to ashes years ago. It was something else. Something colder. 30 years of marriage. 3 decades of shared mornings, shared arguments, shared dreams. Reduced to nothing. You must be the cleaning service, he said politely. His voice was the same. Confident. Smooth. Controlled. I tightened my grip on the handle of my cleaning kit and forced my lips into a professional smile. Yes, sir. Sir. The word felt foreign in my mouth. 3 years earlier, that same man had held my face in his hands and promised me we would grow old together. He used to call me his foundation, his strength, his home. And now I was the cleaning service. If you've ever been erased from someone's life like you meant nothing, like this story, and comment below what you would have done in my place. We weren't always strangers. When we met, he was just a man with ambition and too many big ideas for someone who had nothing. I was working at a small accounting office at the time, barely making enough to cover rent. He talked about starting his own company like it was already real. Most people would have laughed. I didn't. I believed him. That belief cost me everything. We built his business from our tiny apartment. There were nights we couldn't afford proper groceries. We ate instant noodles and shared one soda like it was champagne. I handled his paperwork after coming home from my job. I corrected his proposals. I called potential investors pretending to be the financial coordinator because it sounded more professional than his wife. When he felt defeated, I told him to try again. When he doubted himself, I reminded him who he was. And when he finally secured his first major contract, he cried in my arms. We did it, he said. We. That word meant everything to me. Success didn't change overnight. Crept in slowly. First came better furniture. Then better clothes. Then better neighborhoods. Then better friends. And somewhere between the luxury watches and private dinners, I stopped being we. I became background. He started correcting the way I spoke in front of clients. Let me handle this, he'd say with a tight smile. At events, he introduced me as my wife, never mentioning that I had built half the systems his company relied on. I ignored the signs. Love makes you blind in ways you don't notice until it's too late. The first time I suspected something was wrong was the night he came home smelling like a perfume I didn't own. I asked gently. He laughed. You're imagining things. Gaslighting is quiet. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It makes you question your own memory. Soon he was traveling more, guarding his phone, stepping outside to take calls. Every time I tried to confront him, he turned it back on me. You've changed. You're insecure. You don't understand this level of success. Eventually I stopped asking. Not because I didn't care, but because I was afraid of the answer. The divorce happened in a conference room, not at home, not with tears, with lawyers. He said we had grown apart. I remember staring at his face, waiting for something, regret, sadness, guilt. There was nothing. The woman he left me for was younger, polished, elegant, perfect for his new image. He kept the house, the company, the cars. I signed the papers with a hand that didn't feel like mine. At 48 years old, I walked out with a single suitcase and a settlement that felt more like a polite dismissal than justice. Starting over at that age isn't inspiring. It's humiliating. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, sold my jewelry to cover initial expenses, avoided places we used to go. The hardest part wasn't losing the lifestyle. It was losing my identity. For 30 years I was his partner. Without him I didn't know who I was. Bills kept arriving. Savings drained faster than I expected. Pride doesn't pay rent. So I applied for cleaning work. The first day I wore that uniform, I cried in my car for 10 minutes before entering the building. But survival has a way of numbing embarrassment. You either adapt, or you collapse. I chose to adapt. 3 years passed. I built a quiet routine. Work. Home. Silence. until the agency assigned me to a new property. Luxury district. Large estate. High-paying client. I didn't check the name. If I had, maybe I wouldn't have gone. Or maybe I would have gone anyway, because sometimes fate doesn't ask permission. Just opens the door. And there he was, standing in front of me, looking at me, and seeing nothing. He stepped aside to let me enter. The house was exactly as I remembered it. The staircase I insisted on. The marble island I chose. The chandelier we argued about for weeks. But there were changes too. Different paintings. Different furniture. Different energy. Photos lined the hallway. Him. And her. Smiling on beaches. At galas. In front of places I once dreamed of visiting. I kept my head down and started working. He walked past me twice that afternoon. Not once did his expression shift. To him I was invisible. And strangely, that invisibility gave me power. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't the one exposed. He was. And he didn't even know it. The second time I walked into that house, I felt the weight of every memory pressing down on me. Every hallway, every picture frame, every corner of that place screamed the life I had lost. He still didn't recognize me. He still smiled at me like I was just another employee. And I kept cleaning, polishing surfaces we had chosen together, arranging things just as he liked them. Only now I was invisible. Invisible and yet fully aware. I noticed her immediately, the new woman. Tall, blonde, perfect posture, designer clothes. She moved around the house like she owned it, which in his mind she did. He called her honey constantly, laughing at her jokes, brushing my presence aside without a second thought. A small bitter part of me wanted to scream, to tell him exactly who I was. But I didn't, because right then I realized something. I had power in my silence. Over the next few days I kept observing. He was sloppy, careless with his finances, ignoring letters, bills piled up, arguments with her behind closed doors, late-night phone calls filled with frustration. I cleaned his chaos while he remained oblivious to the storm I had once navigated for him daily. One afternoon, as I dusted his study, I found a folder left on the desk. Curiosity won over caution. Inside were contracts, letters, bank statements, mistakes, oversights, mismanaged investments. I realized then, he wasn't as successful as he appeared. And the more I read, the more I saw cracks I had never noticed before. Weeks passed. I continued cleaning, taking note of every small detail. His new wife had no idea I was standing inches away while he vented, argued, or made decisions. I was learning more about him now than I ever did while we were married. And with each passing day, I felt the old version of me returning. The smart, strategic, capable woman he had once dismissed. Then came the day I walked into the kitchen and overheard an argument. "I trusted you," she screamed. "I told you everything was fine," he shouted back. I froze. Everything was not fine. Not at all. The empire he built wasn't solid. The business was fragile, mistakes had been made, and he was drowning under the weight of his own pride. For the first time I saw him small, human, vulnerable. That night I cleaned quietly, letting him and her fight in the background. I walked through rooms that once echoed with our laughter and plans, knowing that I had seen the truth of him, both the man I loved and the man he had become. I realized something important. Invisibility wasn't weakness. It was observation, power, knowledge. As I folded his shirts and polished the kitchen counter, I made a decision. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't about screaming, exposing, or humiliating. It was about control. I would see this through, step by step, day by day. I would be the one walking out stronger, wiser, and untouchable. And that was when I first felt the thrill of it. The quiet, slow burn of being unseen, yet completely present. Watching him fumble. Watching her arrogance. Watching the life he thought he had built without me begin to show cracks. For the first time since our divorce, I felt alive. It was a rainy afternoon when I first saw him truly vulnerable. He had locked himself in the study, papers scattered across the desk, the phone in his hand trembling slightly. His new wife's voice echoed through the hallway, sharp and irritated. "You promised me the contracts were finalized." He rubbed his forehead, sighing. "I did everything I could." But the panic in his eyes betrayed the truth. He was failing. I paused in the doorway, pretending to organize some cleaning supplies. No one knew I was there. And for the first time in years, I felt the rush of satisfaction. Not cruelty, not revenge, but the clarity of seeing reality with no illusions. Later that evening, he emerged from the study, still flustered. His new wife followed, fuming. "You need to fix this before tomorrow," she snapped. He nodded silently. I carried the mop quietly past them, keeping my gaze lowered. But he glanced up. For a brief second, something flickered in his expression. Confusion? Recognition? I wasn't sure. The following days were a mix of chaos and discovery. I cleaned every corner of the house, overheard every private conversation, and noticed every subtle flaw in their life together. The new woman was arrogant, careless, often dismissive. She didn't pay attention to the details. She didn't notice the financial slips or mismanaged projects. He, meanwhile, was trying desperately to maintain an image of control. And I was the ghost he had once loved. The ghost who knew every weakness, every mistake, every truth. One evening, while organizing the study, I found a hidden drawer. Inside were letters, unpaid bills, and contracts he had forgotten about. It was as if the house itself was leaving breadcrumbs for me, the one person who could read them. I realized then. He might have built an empire on paper, but it was fragile, unstable, and ultimately falling apart without the foundation we had built together. I started keeping quiet records, mentally noting dates, amounts, and decisions. Every small error, every sign of collapse. I didn't need anyone to see. I didn't need him to notice. This was my preparation. Not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for my ultimate freedom, my ultimate return to power. Then came the day I finally spoke to him directly. He was in the living room, looking at an overdue invoice. His shoulders slumped, his arrogance replaced with tension. "Excuse me," I said softly, holding a dust cloth. He looked up, startled. "Yes." I didn't say anything more. I just handed him a folder with some papers I had organized. He took it without a word. But I saw it, the brief flash of recognition in his eyes. Not fully, not yet, but enough to know he remembered me. That night I replayed the day in my mind. Every glance, every moment, every detail. The thrill of being unseen yet completely present was intoxicating. For 3 years I had been building strength quietly. Now I had a purpose. Observation, patience, and knowledge were my allies. The real confrontation hadn't even begun. And when it did, I would be ready. Days turned into weeks. I continued cleaning, silent, invisible, watching their interactions. The new wife's arrogance grew. She belittled him in subtle ways, unaware of the fragile empire she was sitting on. He tried to appease her, tried to maintain control, tried to act as though everything was perfect. But cracks were appearing. Small at first, then undeniable. And every crack reminded me of what I had once built, and what I still carried within me. Competence, strength, and memory. It was during one of these evenings that I realized something crucial. Being invisible didn't make me powerless. It made me strategic. It made me untouchable. And for the first time in years I smiled, not because of hate but because of clarity. He had forgotten me, but I had not forgotten myself. And that, I knew, would be my ultimate advantage. The morning sunlight filtered through the grand windows, painting the marble floors in gold. I moved silently, dusting shelves and polishing counters, while he argued with his assistant about a delayed payment. Every gesture, every expression, every mistake, it was all visible to me. He had no idea the woman he had once vowed forever to was in the room, watching, analyzing, waiting. Later that afternoon, she stormed into the kitchen, heels clicking on the floor. "You promised me we'd close that deal," she shouted. He ran a hand over his face, sighing. "I'm trying, give me a minute." I kept cleaning, pretending to focus on the counters, but my ears were tuned to every word. The arrogance she carried like a shield made her careless. She overlooked small mistakes, she underestimated him. And, unknowingly, she underestimated me too. That evening, I found myself alone in the study. The papers and ledgers sprawled across the desk told a story I had seen before, one I knew all too well. Errors in accounts, missed deadlines, a lack of foresight that could topple any business. I felt the old sense of control return. This was knowledge. Power disguised as observation. He had built a castle of glass. Fragile. And I knew exactly how it could shatter. The first real psychological confrontation came unexpectedly. He was seated at the desk, reviewing some documents, when I entered with a stack of papers he had left scattered. "Here," I said softly, handing them to him. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second his face froze. Recognition? Shock? I couldn't tell. You organized these?" he asked incredulously. "Yes," I replied. Calm. Neutral. Invisible authority in my voice. He nodded slowly, and for a moment the air between us shifted. The power dynamics had subtly changed. Days passed. I continued my work silently, but inside my mind was calculating. Every conversation, every argument, every slight mistake was noted. I wasn't planning an outburst or a confrontation. I was preparing. I was watching. And the more I observed, the more I realized just how fragile their life together was. One rainy evening, he left the house in a hurry, papers clutched in his hands. His new wife called after him, frustrated and shrill. "You promised," she screamed. I quietly finished cleaning the room, letting their chaos unfold around me. The thrill wasn't in seeing him fail. The thrill was in watching the truth unfold naturally, while I remained untouched, untouchable, and patient. Weeks turned into months. He started noticing things, small details I had left meticulously in place, reminders of competence he had once relied on. First he ignored them. Then he glanced my way, lingering just a second too long. A spark of recognition. I smiled silently inside. I wasn't being vindictive. I was simply reclaiming the quiet, unspoken power I had lost. The new wife, arrogant and careless, never suspected me. She mocked him gently when he struggled with decisions, unaware that I was the one observing everything. I noticed her slipping. Her control over him was imperfect. Her judgments were clouded by pride. And I saw opportunity. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Not exposure. But opportunity to finally prove something to myself. That night, as I locked up and prepared to leave, I reflected on how far I had come. From humiliation and invisibility to observation and knowledge. From despair to strategy. From being erased to being fully aware. The first part of my journey had ended. The real story, my quiet, calculated, inevitable comeback, was only just beginning. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, I noticed him pacing in the study. The faint lines on his forehead deepened with worry, the corners of his mouth twitching with frustration. She was in the living room scrolling on her phone, occasionally shouting a command or criticism at him. He tried to remain composed, tried to smile, tried to act as though everything was perfect. But I saw the cracks, tiny, almost invisible, yet undeniable. I kept my movements quiet, dusting, arranging, cleaning. And I observed every small mistake she made, every subtle lapse in judgment, every mismanaged financial note he overlooked. I remembered the countless nights I had spent correcting these same mistakes. And for the first time in years, I felt the old confidence return. Not arrogance, not revenge, but a quiet certainty that I had been here before, and I could navigate it again. The first subtle action of my quiet comeback came unexpectedly. I noticed a file she had carelessly left on the counter. A ledger with numbers misaligned, an invoice incorrectly marked as paid. I gently corrected it and placed it back where it belonged. Later that day he picked it up, scanning through the numbers. "You did this?" he asked, his voice calm but betraying surprise. "Yes," I replied. A flicker of recognition crossed his eyes. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt, but enough. From that moment on, I began strategically influencing their lives in small, almost imperceptible ways. Nothing malicious. Nothing reckless. A misplaced receipt here. A subtle correction there. A gentle nudge that pointed out a minor oversight. Every action was calculated. Every observation recorded silently in my mind. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't exposure. It was preparation. And the more I did it, the more I felt my strength returning. Weeks passed, and their tension escalated naturally. She became more impatient. He grew more anxious. And I remained the quiet observer. The invisible force who knew every detail, every mistake, every truth. I walked through the house folding his shirts, dusting the counters, straightening chairs, all while noting the small cracks in their life that would one day widen. One night, as I cleaned the study, he paused behind me. "You seem familiar," he said casually, almost as if testing his own memory. I froze for a heartbeat, then turned slowly. "Yes," I said calmly. The recognition hit him in a wave, sudden and undeniable. "Wait, is it you?" I nodded. He swallowed, flustered, unable to mask the surprise, the guilt. The realization that the woman he had thought was gone forever was standing right in front of him, quietly reclaiming her space in his world. That night, I returned home and reflected on everything I had witnessed. The arrogance of his new wife. The fragility of the empire he had built. The sheer strength I had rediscovered within myself. For the first time since our divorce, I felt a calm power. Not anger. Not hate. Clarity. Observation. Patience. And I knew. The real comeback hadn't begun yet. I continued to move quietly through their lives strategically. Every small action, every subtle correction, every observation was a reminder to myself of what I had once built, and what I could build again. It wasn't about exposing them. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself. Days turned into weeks, and the more I observed, the more I realized the truth. Being invisible doesn't make you powerless. It makes you untouchable. It makes you strategic. It makes you ready. It was late afternoon when he finally spoke to me directly, without pretense or polite distance. I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice uneven, almost hesitant. I kept dusting the counter, pretending not to notice the tremor in his tone. "Yes," I said softly. "You didn't." The air was thick with unspoken words. I remembered the years we had shared, the nights we had planned, the dreams we had built together. And yet here we were, strangers again, but not entirely. His new wife had left for an event, giving us a rare few hours alone. He ran his fingers through his hair, staring at the scattered papers I had organized for him. You still remember how I like things done," he said quietly. I smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was measured, calm, controlled. "I always did," I said. And for a moment he froze. Recognition, guilt, surprise. Everything flickering across his face at once. I realized then that power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from calm, calculated presence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I didn't cry. I simply existed in the space we had once shared, letting him see what he had lost. Over the next days, subtle tension built in the house. The new wife grew more careless, more demanding. She underestimated him, underestimated herself, and most importantly, underestimated me. I watched every argument, every sigh, every expression, and I began to influence events quietly. A misfiled contract here. Corrected invoice there. A gently suggested solution that nudged him toward decisions he hadn't considered. I was no longer just observing. I was participating silently, strategically. One evening, I overheard a heated argument in the kitchen. "You're ruining everything," she yelled. "I'm doing my best," he shouted back. I paused in the doorway, pretending to adjust a picture frame. He didn't see me. He didn't know I was there. But I saw it all. Every crack, every flaw, every tension building between them. And I understood. This was the moment when patience would pay off. That night, I returned to my small apartment and reflected on everything I had observed. For the first time in years, I felt the old confidence returning. The confidence of the woman who had built his empire with him. The woman he had taken for granted. The woman who could now quietly, strategically, reclaim her power without raising her voice. I made a plan, not for revenge in the conventional sense, but for self-restoration. Step by step, observation by observation, I would reclaim what was always mine. Control, dignity, and awareness. And when the time was right, I would act. Not with malice, not with anger, but with precision. The subtle tension in the house became palpable. She didn't understand why things were slightly off, why decisions were being corrected behind her back, why he seemed flustered at times despite her confidence. He didn't know why he felt disoriented whenever I offered small, silent guidance. And I realized, invisibility was more powerful than confrontation. That night, as I lay in my modest apartment, I smiled quietly to myself. The slow burn of observation, patience, and strategy was my ally. I had been invisible for 3 years. Now I was poised to be unstoppable. It was late evening when the first real confrontation happened. I had been cleaning the living room, dusting the shelves, when I noticed him standing frozen near the doorway. His new wife was nowhere in sight, having gone to a gala that evening. The house was quiet, yet heavy with unspoken tension. You're still here," he said finally, his voice low. I turned slowly, a calm, almost serene smile on my face. "Yes," I replied softly. "I've always been here." Recognition hit him like a lightning bolt. His eyes widened slightly, mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again. For the first time in months, I saw him hesitate. The man who had once ruled over his empire with confidence now looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. I didn't expect. I thought," he stammered. "You thought I was gone?" I interrupted gently. "I never left. I just waited." And in that moment he realized something he hadn't acknowledged before. The woman who had built, corrected, and saved him countless times was still standing. Fully present. Fully aware. I moved slowly toward the study, organizing a few scattered papers as I went. "You always underestimate what you can't see," I said, voice calm but firm. He followed me with his eyes, unsure whether to step closer or stay back. "Do you remember the contracts from last month?" I continued. "The ones you thought were perfect?" He nodded, tense. "They weren't. I corrected them. Quietly. While no one noticed. Just like I always did." The weight of that realization hit him. He realized how much he had relied on me, and how little he had appreciated it. For the next few minutes we stood in silence. No anger. No yelling. Just awareness. Then his new wife returned. She entered the room, oblivious to the undercurrent of power shifting in the air. "You two alone?" she asked, tossing her coat onto the couch, confidence dripping from every gesture. I looked at her calmly, noting every arrogance-fueled gesture, every flaw, every misstep she had made in this household. "You always act like everything is yours," I said softly. "But you haven't built anything yourself." She froze. His eyes darted between us, confusion, guilt, and fear flickering across his face. For the first time she realized she was not in control. And I wasn't trying to humiliate her overtly. I just let the truth settle in. Over the next few weeks, subtle shifts began to take place. He hesitated before making decisions. She grew increasingly careless, anxious, unsure. I remained calm, invisible, yet undeniably present. Every small correction, every quiet intervention reminded them both that the foundation of their lives, what they thought was stability, was fragile. One evening, he confronted me alone again. I don't understand how you still manage all of this. How do you know what to do?" I looked at him, the same calm I had always carried. "I've always known. I just wasn't always allowed to act," I said softly. Recognition and guilt swirled in his eyes, and for the first time, he realized he had underestimated me in ways he could never undo. And in that quiet tension I felt it, the power of patience, observation, and knowledge. I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to expose. The subtle humiliation, the realization of dependence, the slow unraveling of arrogance. That was my strength. I was reclaiming my place without a single dramatic gesture. As I left the house that night, I looked back once. The man I had loved, the woman he had chosen over me, both unaware that the world I had left behind was crumbling quietly, precisely, and inevitably. And I knew, the slow strategic rise back to my power had only just begun. It was a chilly evening when everything shifted. I had been cleaning quietly in the study when I noticed a folder left carelessly on the desk. Curiosity mixed with instinct. I opened it. Inside were bank statements, emails, and photos, evidence of everything he had been hiding. The late-night meetings, secret accounts, and messages to another woman, one I knew far too well. I froze. Not because I hadn't suspected, but because the truth was more painful than I could have imagined. The other woman wasn't just a stranger. It was my own younger sister. Every dinner, every family gathering, every casual comment she made now had a new sinister meaning. I felt my stomach twist with betrayal so deep, it left me dizzy. Hours later, I confronted him. You married her?" I asked softly, voice trembling with barely contained rage. His face fell. It's complicated," he muttered, attempting excuses I had no patience for. "Complicated?" I echoed, incredulous. "You promised me forever. You promised me trust. And you destroyed everything with her." His silence said more than words ever could. Then I reached out for the folder, flipping through pages that mapped their secret life together. All the lies, all the betrayals, all the moments I had unknowingly ignored. And my sister, my own blood, had been the accomplice. I felt the world collapse around me, but only for a moment, because deep inside something stirred. I remembered all the years I had built him up, all the nights I had sacrificed, all the moments I had guided him without recognition. And I realized, the same strength that had built his empire, the same resilience that had survived his abandonment, was still mine. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't naive. I was unstoppable. Over the next days, I began quietly reclaiming control, not just over the house I cleaned, but over my life. I meticulously organized files, corrected mistakes, and even guided his failing investments without their knowledge. Every small correction reminded him of what he had lost. The woman who had once been his foundation, now rising silently but undeniably. The emotional climax didn't need shouting. It wasn't in confrontation or tears. It was in the subtle shift of power. The silent acknowledgement that I was aware, I was capable, and I was no longer beneath anyone. He looked at me one afternoon and finally admitted, quietly, "I underestimated you." I nodded. "Yes," I said softly, "and that was your biggest mistake." Then came the moment of revelation to my sister. I didn't yell. I didn't humiliate. I simply laid out the facts calmly, step by step. She saw the truth in my eyes, the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the strength I had gained. For the first time, she understood what she had done. And in that silence, I felt closure, not from anger but from power reclaimed. That night, I stood in my small apartment reflecting. The man I had loved had betrayed me. My sister had betrayed me. But I had survived. I had learned. I had grown. And the woman who once had been invisible had risen, stronger than ever. The days after the revelation were surreal. He tried to regain composure, tried to assert control, tried to act as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The quiet confidence in my eyes, the calm knowledge I carried. It was a force he couldn't ignore. I continued my routine in the house, but everything felt different. Every step I took, every small action I made, reminded him of what he had lost. He was struggling to maintain the facade of authority, while I silently demonstrated that competence, intelligence, and patience were not his to claim. Then came the first public acknowledgement of my strength. In a casual dinner meeting, he floundered over a minor error. I stepped in quietly, correcting it without drama, my presence understated yet commanding. Everyone noticed. Not with applause, not with recognition, but with respect. And that respect was mine to hold. Meanwhile, my sister attempted to defend herself, But her excuses fell flat. She realized she had underestimated me, the woman she thought was broken, the woman she thought had no place in their lives anymore. Her arrogance dissolved in silence, and I watched, composed, unmoved. I started rebuilding my own life outside their household. A small apartment became a home. A part-time consulting role became a bridge to independence. Friends I had neglected reached out, seeing the resilience I had gained. And every small step reminded me, I was not the woman defined by betrayal or loss. I was the woman who had survived it all. The final twist came unexpectedly. One evening, as I walked past their house on my way home, I overheard my former husband on a call. "I can't, she's too strong. I can't handle it anymore." I paused, letting the words sink in. For the first time, he realized that power had shifted irreversibly. I didn't gloat. I didn't yell. I just smiled. Because the comeback wasn't about him. It was about me. Weeks later, I received an offer to consult for a company that recognized my talent and leadership. It was the kind of opportunity one had always deserved. I accepted, stepping fully into a life of independence, competence, and self-worth. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't powerless. I was unstoppable. The final confrontation had been quiet. No yelling. No drama. No exposure. Just truth, patience, and strength. I had been betrayed. I had been humiliated. I had been abandoned. And yet here I was, rising stronger than ever. I stood in my apartment one evening, looking out at the city lights, reflecting on everything. The betrayal had been painful, yes. The humiliation had cut deep. But the comeback, the quiet, calculated, unstoppable comeback, was sweeter than any victory I could have imagined. I had reclaimed my life. I had reclaimed my dignity. I had reclaimed myself. And nothing, not him, not my sister, not the past, could ever take that away. This was my story of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimate resurgence. The story of a woman who survived the worst, rose above it, and became untouchable. The story of me. Months had passed since I discovered the truth. The betrayal, the secret marriage, the double life. And in that time I had rebuilt myself piece by piece, silently, strategically, and with unwavering resolve. The woman who had been abandoned, humiliated, and betrayed was no longer invisible. She was unstoppable. I moved into my own apartment, smaller than the house I had once shared with him, but it was mine. Everything in it reflected me, my tastes, my style, my independence. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need anyone's validation. I had learned that the greatest power comes from self-reliance, clarity, and patience. Work became my sanctuary. The consulting role I had taken had grown into something bigger, something I was proud of. Clients sought me out for advice and expertise, unaware that I was the woman who had survived betrayal and emerged stronger. And for the first time in years I felt pride. Real, unshakable pride. I thought of him sometimes, my ex-husband, and my sister. But the thoughts were no longer filled with pain or rage. They were reminders. Reminders of what I had endured. Reminders of the strength I had discovered. Reminders of the life I had reclaimed. Occasionally our paths crossed. He would glance at me in the street, hesitation in his eyes, recognition that I was no longer the woman he had underestimated. She would avoid me entirely, aware that the quiet, composed woman standing before her held a power she could never touch. And I would smile gently, silently, because I no longer needed them. I had learned the greatest lesson. Life doesn't always go as planned. People betray, abandon, and hurt. But rising above the chaos, reclaiming your dignity, and trusting your own strength, that is the true victory. I had done that. Evenings in my apartment were peaceful now. I would sip tea by the window, overlooking the city lights, reflecting on the journey I had taken. From heartbreak to betrayal. From invisibility to strategy. From despair to empowerment. And I had emerged victorious. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I was independent. I was untouchable. And I had rewritten my story in my own words, on my own terms. The past was a lesson. The betrayal was a teacher. And the woman I had become, A woman stronger, wiser, and unstoppable was the ultimate triumph. I had walked through fire and emerged unscathed. I had faced heartbreak and emerged unbroken. I had been invisible and emerged undeniable. This was my final chapter. Not of pain, not of revenge, but of empowerment. Of strength reclaimed. Of dignity restored. Of a life fully, unapologetically my own. And for the first time I could say with certainty, I was free. I was powerful. I was me.